So, people tell me my gaming computer is a huge bottleneck, having an RTX 3060 with an i7 3770. Well, today we're going to be causing an even bigger bottleneck. I'm going to be pairing an RTX 3060 with a AMD LE-1640 with 1 core and 1 thread from 2009, which cannot barely handle watching YouTube videos. The computer also has 6GB of DDR2 RAM, and also a Quad 600 graphics card, which is equivalent to around a GT 710. It gets the job done because all it does is web browse. But we're gonna be taking that out and putting an RTX 3060 in there to cause one of the biggest bottlenecks on earth. And also, this is the slowest computer I have that actually can use a graphics card besides a GP, so that's also something going for it. Upgrading the graphics card was pretty straightforward. The only thing I had to do, besides installing the graphics card, was replace the 13-year-old eMachine stock power supply with something slightly better, because the 170-watt eMachine power supply from 2009 is not going to cut it. Well, at least it probably won't without causing a toxic electrical fire. And the first time I turned it on, nothing showed up on screen. I couldn't work out why, so I uninstalled the graphics card, installed it again, and then it still didn't work. Then I uninstalled the power supply and installed it again, and it still didn't work. Then I finally realized a monitor needs to be plugged in. It won't plug itself in. After I plugged the monitor in, it finally started working. That was a overly complicated fix of just plugging a wire in. So I decided to set this computer up with a brand new hard drive. Yes, just a hard drive, not an SSD, just to see how it handled with a hard drive. Installing Windows 10 took 38 minutes, which is quite a long time. A hard drive normally doesn't take 38 minutes to install Windows 10, so the CPU definitely did not like installing Windows 10, but after a while it did chug through and get the installation done. Then there was Windows updates. Yes, Windows updates, and those took 5.5 hours to install. Just some updates. Granted, they were around 9 updates, but that is still a long time to install updates. Once all of the updates were done, I decided to do the momentally insanely hard task of opening up Microsoft Edge. Yes, I know, the hardest web browser on earth to open. Okay, it's not really that hard to open, but it took a long time on this. After some waiting, it did eventually open, which is nice, though it still wasn't fast. I decided to run a benchmark of Cinebench R23, and it got a score of 204. This is a multi-core test, because I couldn't do a single-core test, because it's just blanked out. There's no way to actually do a single-core test on this for some reason. I don't know why, because this is a single-core CPU. It would seem like the multi-core one should be blanked out, and you can only do a single-core one, but, well, you can only do a multi-core one with a 1-core CPU, so that's something. I also tried to do some web browsing, because I figured maybe the RTX 3060 might be used a little bit for loading websites more than the Quad 600, but not really. It felt exactly identical to the Quad 600. It worked, but it was quite slow, but after some determination, it was able to play back some videos. Then I tried to do some downloading of some games and applications, and it did not go so smoothly. I tried to do some stuff in the background as well, like play back some YouTube videos, just because, you know, most people probably would want to listen to YouTube while they wait for stuff to happen. And the CPU was struggling so badly to download and install all these things with the video playing in the background, the video stopped playing back a lot of times for over 30 seconds at a time. To give you an example of how slow it is, here is a real-time loading of Roblox, because I figure Roblox is a game that most people would probably play on this versus something else like CSGO or maybe Fortnite, because Roblox does have a lot of lightweight games, and even Roblox's website took this long to load. I don't know when it's gonna stop loading actually, but you know, it's still working on it. And it's still working on it, and stuff is just sort of not happening. At least the mouse isn't frozen, though that did happen a few times where the mouse decided it wanted to freeze. Oh, there we go, got some games in, and there we go, the whole thing is loaded, nice. That only took too long. Then I decided to hop into a game of CSGO, and it was not really smooth at all. In the menu, okay, it took me around 3 hours to change the settings from whatever it had the preset to low because, well, I want to play on the lowest settings on this. Yes, it took that long to actually change settings because when I changed the setting, it just sat there and loaded forever. But finally, after a while, it did load, and there was something randomly wrong with the taskbar as well. It kept flickering in and out the entire time. And I did actually manage to get into a game, and in the game it actually was somewhat playable. It was only getting probably 15 to 20 frames per second. I couldn't get the frame rate counter working. I think I needed to restart the game, and I was not about to wait another hour for it to start back up. But it was somewhat playable, but it was very stuttery. At times I froze for over a second, which was not good. Next up on the list of games I want to play is Minecraft Bedrock on a server with RTX. To be exact, the Kelly's RTX resource pack with RTX enabled and DLSS on the CubeCraft server. The reason I am not playing on single player is because this computer cannot load up a single player Minecraft Bedrock Edition world. I do not know why, but it just can't. It just gets hung up and never loads on a single player world. With RTX enabled, it was running somewhat decently. Well, it was running slightly worse than without RTX, which both ways it doesn't run good, but it was somewhat playable to a certain extent. It is not playable with or without RTX, but it is slightly less playable with RTX. But it does look a lot better, so that might give it a few extra points. I wasn't able to get the frame rate counter working again, for some reason, I don't know why. I even went back to the normal installation of Windows 10 on the SSD, and it still didn't work. Next up is Microsoft Solitaire. Yes, I know Microsoft Solitaire is a really easy game to run. It's so easy, Microsoft assumes your computer can run it. And this can play the game pretty decently, though it actually somehow manages to lag even on Solitaire. It got down to around 30 frames per second at times, though it averaged out to be around 40 to 50 most of the time. To be fair, I think you would be fine with 15 frames per second in Solitaire because all you do is move cards, literally nothing else. So a 30 plus FPS experience should pretty much be flawless. Next up is Roblox Arsenal. Now in Roblox, the settings are all the way down to the minimum, and so are the settings for the game itself, which is Roblox Arsenal. And in the game, I was getting between roughly 0 and 10 frames per second, or basically completely unplayable for a shooter game like this. You would probably at least want 30 frames per second in this game, and you're only getting around 5 to 10 most of the time, so this is definitely 100% unplayable. Though this is a rather demanding Roblox game. Other games like Zombie Attack, this should be able to handle with relative ease, meaning it should be able to get between 20 and 30 frames per second on those games. I know 20 to 30 frames per second is not great, but it is a lot better than 0 to 10. For some reason, Steam games were having problems downloading, so I decided to restart the computer and it decided to blue screen while restarting. So that just adds a cherry onto the top of all this lagging. Next up is the FireStrike Benchmark, and the FireStrike Benchmark took a long time to complete, meaning I didn't have enough time for it to complete. It went through one round and it was fine, and then the second round it was going through, well, it just didn't go through it. It spent several hours sitting there loading it, or at least I'm assuming it was loading it. The CPU was at 100% and nothing was happening, so I finally was running out of time, so I just ended the test, because I didn't have all day to wait for it to get done. Next up on the test of games and benchmarks is BeamNG Drive. The game actually loaded into Grid Map, and I figured if it ran Grid Map, it might be able to run some other maps like West Coast USA. Well, it couldn't even run Grid Map. Granted, it did actually load into the map. The thing is though, just driving a car, it had about 5 seconds of delay between you hitting, let's just say, the forward arrow button and the car actually starting to accelerate. Same with the brakes and every other control in the game. I'm sure for some people 5 frames per second is playable, but for me at least it is not playable, and for the far majority of people on Earth who play games, 5 frames per second probably is not playable. Then I decided to slap the settings all the way up to Ultra to see how playable is the game on Ultra settings, if low is not playable. And it is not very playable again. What a surprise! Not really. I mean, at this point, what do you expect? Though it does look a lot better than on low settings, of course, though it does come with a performance hit because some of the settings in the game actually go over and impact the CPU and not just the graphics card. So it is a lot more laggy. But a little bit more lag is not gonna hurt much at this point because it's already a stuttery slideshow. And the next game up on the list is Muck. It actually surprised me how it performed because I would have expected it to perform a little bit better, because from my experience with Muck, it is a really lightweight game, but it only managed to get 15 frames per second on this computer. Granted, I do not think many games, if any, are meant for one core in 2022. But you know, if you want to play some Muck, you can on this somewhat comfortably. I mean, it's not playable if you're trying to do PvP, but you know, it's something you can play besides Solitaire. And of course, it was on the lowest settings. I did try Ultra, and it did run, but it was a stuttery mess. So what is my conclusion? Should you stick an RTX 3060 in a single core computer in 2022? Of course not. I mean, this is the worst possible pairing on earth probably. This CPU bottlenecks an HD 5450, so it's going to completely bottleneck anything you put in here basically. Though if you're super worried about bottlenecking this computer, for some reason either use the iGPU or stick maybe something like an HD 5450 or a NVIDIA G100 in here, and you shouldn't have much of a bottleneck. Granted, you might have to play on lower settings. The moral of today's story is just don't play on a one-core CPU in 2022. Get at least a Core 2 Duo or Core 2 Quad, or maybe a brand new Pentium G7400, because those will do a lot better than this. Or literally any CPU that has more than one core. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to leave it a like, that would help out a ton. Either way, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.